Hi, this is Amanda Johnson. I was assigned the Sexual Abuse Discussion Board and Research Board for this week. So I'm going to talk about an article called The Disclosure Experiences of Male Child Sexual Abuse Survivors. It was completed in 2016 and focuses solely on the male experience of disclosure of childhood sexual abuse. So during my research, and as stated in the article, there's very few studies that seem to focus solely on the male experience of disclosing childhood sexual abuse. Due to this, the two authors that are both social workers, Gagnier and Colin Vizina, decided to examine previously published literature and complete an analysis during a small sample study of a larger CSA Canadian study. Looking at the previously published literature, they found that in one the prevalence of CSA between 1980 and 2008, 18% were female experiences and only 7.6% were male experiences. And in another study, they found that 1 in 5 were women's experiences, where 1 in 10 were men's experiences. So they wanted to see what the difference was and why there was such a big gap between the male experience that was reported and the female experience that was reported. So we know that disclosure proves to be painful for both men and women, regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, any of that. But we find in the article and in probably in today's society, as you have found, that the lack of data and lack of disclosure could be due to norms and stereotypes within our society. We look at in our society how men are thought to be dominant and aggressive and supposed to be the strong ones rather than females. And it's thought to be that they're incapable of being sexual abuse victims, especially to a female abuser. However, we'll talk about later in the video, and it'll talk about in the article how that can actually become a huge problem for men to disclose childhood sexual abuse. So the study chose to go off of a larger study that I talked about just a few seconds ago that was done in Canada. It was out of 69 male and female participants, and I'm going to read you the information on who was included and who was not. So between May 2011 and July 2012, 69 male and female participants were recruited through community and mental health organizations that offered support services to sexual abuse victims in 4 large Canadian cities. Inclusion criteria for participants were A, being over the age of 19, B, being a self-reported victim of CSA, and C, receiving or having recently received services for CSA in one of the organizations in which the recruitment took place. So this is going to be important because it's going to talk about how these individuals are over the age of 19, but this abuse happened when they were considered a child. So we looked out of the 69 people, they're going to choose the 17 males that were included in the study, which is only 25% of the entire sample. So that should tell you something there. Out of the entire 69 people, only 17 of them are males who are disclosing childhood abuse. So the men ranged from ages 19 to 67 and came from various education backgrounds, some held jobs and some didn't. Some needed the interviews in English and some needed them in French. So to quote the article, here the total number of men in the sample that were sexually abused and their ranges of how and when and by who. So 4 of them were sexually abused by women, while 13 were abused by men. Several men were sexually abused by a close relative. 2 were sexually abused by a parent. 1 was abused by his mother and the other by his father. 2 were sexually abused by a sibling. 1 was by his sister and the other by his older brother. And 3 were sexually abused by a family member other than a parent or sibling. 3 of the men were sexually abused by a neighbor. 2 were sexually abused by a teenage acquaintance. 6 were sexually abused by a trusted adult, and it gives the example of a family friend or an older sibling's spouse. And only 1 was sexually abused by a stranger. 3 men were sexually abused by more than 1 person. For 2 participants, the CSA abuse was committed by 2 different men, and for the third, the abuse was committed by both male and female abusers and took place at different times. 1 participant did not identify his abuser. The study took a merge approach to best report and examine the data because they really wanted to get information out there on why the gap, why the big difference between male disclosures and female disclosures. Interviews were done as semi-structured interviews. They were done ranging from 45 to 90 minutes over the telephone and were digitally recorded. 3 research assistants, all who held master's degrees in social work and were registered social workers at the time, did the interview questions. They focused on the disclosure process and included all open-ended questions. That way everyone could tell their own experience and their own story. So the questions that they included are on page 227, but I'm going to talk about just a couple of the really important ones that we're going to talk about in the video. So some of the questions: what prompted you to seek help about the abuse at this time and with this organization? Why? What happened or changed? How positive or negative was this experience for you? Was it the first time you disclosed? If yes, what could have helped you disclose before? Were there any other attempts to disclose? And then did you request help or services before? If it wasn't their first time, they wanted to know about another time that they had disclosed, who they disclosed to, what was different about this time rather than the time before or the times before, and what led to the disclosure, how positive or negative was the experience for them. So the disclosure of these 17 male adults at this point from their childhood abuse came out to show that they had 2 main themes, with each having 6 subset themes. So the first main theme related to the disclosure trajectory of men and included disclosing for the first time, waiting to tell, stereotypes contributing to delayed disclosure, trying to forget about the abuse, breaking the isolation as a motivator to disclose, and the impact of various forms of media on disclosure. And we'll talk about all of those a little bit during this video. The second theme described in depth the disclosure experiences of participants and included positive disclosure experiences, negative disclosure experiences, the desire to protect others, support in a non-therapeutic context, experiences of non-disclosure, and experiences disclosing with ease. So the disclosure of the 17 participants included and is listed in the article as 5 disclosed for the first time to a professional, 5 disclosed for the first time to a family member, and only 3 of these were in childhood. 3 disclosed to a spouse or partner for the first time, while 3 others chose to disclose to a close friend. All men waited to disclose, however, only 4 of those 17 disclosed during childhood. 2 made an attempt to disclose in childhood, but were not taken seriously, and it actually lists in the article that one of the experiences that one of the men had, and the stories in the article, was that his dad didn't believe him and continued to see the abuser because he was a prominent member of society. So we wanted to talk about why. Why are male victims or male survivors at this point waiting to disclose until after childhood, and what is their experience like that they are waiting so long and that they're having these negative experiences in disclosing that this abuse happened to them years and years ago. So part of it's going to be stereotypes, and the article addresses all kinds of stereotypes that happen to men especially, and I'll just touch on a few of them through the video. So 6 of the men spoke about the taboo of being recognized as a victim. It's that word, it's that victim word rather than a survivor. But at that time, they were a victim because they were a child. They didn't want to be recognized as that. 4 were concerned about being labeled as a homosexual. And in the article, it talks about how at that point in 2016, these men still considered our society, and when they were a child, as a homophobic society, and how that label then changes their entire life. 2 were afraid that they would be labeled as a potential abuser. So if abuse happened to them, they would do it to someone else. 2 of the men were abused by women and were afraid of coming forward and the taboo that comes along with being male and being abused by a woman. In the article, it talks about how as a society, we see women as the weaker sex and the weaker gender, and how the male is supposed to be the more dominant one, and how could you possibly be abused by the weaker gender, and how does that challenge your manhood? The other thing that they talk about, and something that I put in the discussion board, is the quote from one of the survivors that talks about how he was given basically a high five, and the people were envious of him that a woman took advantage of him in childhood and abused him. And why is that such a thing? So they focused on that a little bit more in the article, but I don't want to say too much because I want to know your opinion on it. 9 of those participants tried to repress elements of their abuse history by remaining in denial because they didn't want to talk about this. They didn't want to be the victim. They didn't want to be labeled as a homosexual. They didn't want to be seen as weak. They didn't want to be labeled as a potential abuser. So when we look at the decision to disclose, it was hard, and it took some of the survivors, over 30 years to disclose childhood abuse. But knowing they listed certain things and certain aspects that were helpful to them, and knowing other victims of childhood abuse, sexual abuse, helped participants disclose. And actually, it helped 8 of them, of the 17. They recognized that they were not alone and that others had experienced the same thing, and that this didn't just happen to them. It didn't make them who they are. It was something that unfortunately happened to them and that they had grown from. They recognized that they were not alone, and 8 of them were positively impacted by the media. 4 were impacted by hearing or viewing the stories of survivors, and the article specifically mentions an episode of Oprah when she had her show, if you're from around here, that talked about male survivors specifically. And one of the survivors listed that as the reason that he finally disclosed and was able to disclose. And 4 were made more comfortable by reading autobiographies and biographies of survivors. Their experiences greatly varied. Only 2 of the participants expressed having a positive experience during their initial disclosure. So they told someone, and only 2 of the 17 were greeted with support and open arms, which is a shame. And 12 of those other participants stated that they had had at least one positive disclosure, although their first may not have been. Of the 12 men who described having at least one negative disclosure, they described being silenced and told to never tell a soul that this had happened to them. And that story is in the article. And it's about a little boy in the hospital, and his grandmother tells him that, and it is heartbreaking to think that that was his experience of wanting to be supported and wanting to be heard. They tell about having it received as just another thing. It wasn't any big deal. Why are you worried about it? And that is also in the article as well. Or having it used as a threat against them. Spouses and partners used that as a threat, or used it as something in an argument, and brought it up against them and against them and against them. And that experience is in the article as well. However, their experiences during disclosure, 6 participants stated they wanted to protect other children from this happening to them. They didn't want them to go through this whole process and this whole disclosure process over and over again every time they told their story. And they didn't want them to go through the experience in general. They wanted them to be protected. 13 survivors received some sort of support from someone in their lives, and only a few noted that non-disclosure was just as taxing as disclosure had been. Sorry, I'm going to look for my quote for you. So we're going to talk about the disclosure trajectory now. That was one of the things that they came out with as a main theme. And the study found the following results. So the disclosure trajectory of each man was just as unique as his personal story was of abuse. The first person the participant chose to disclose to seemed to reflect the bond that they felt with the individual more than anything else. While first disclosures generally were found to be based on the level of comfort the victim felt for the person, they weren't always a positive disclosure, no matter the bond that they thought that they had had with them. Participants were deterred from disclosing by the fear of repercussions and the fear of judgment based on stereotypes associated with sexual abuse in males. Concealment is generally the way that males deal with childhood experience and are expected to deal with them, based on our social mythology and how we view men and boys. However, hearing stories from other survivors, personally knowing a CSA survivor, attending therapy, and eventually sharing their own stories had great healing power, even with negative experiences. More recently, the media has proven to be a positive factor during the sheer amount of conversation we are having on taboo subjects such as abuse. Immediately, I thought of the Me Too movement that has been going around, especially with more men getting involved in the Me Too movement. And one of my discussion questions is about that. So tell me what you think about that. Um, the men in the study emphasized that um, with feeling that they had been listened to, were safe, were believed, and were not judged by the person they disclosed to were some of the elements that led them to feel positively about their experience. And they want to make CSA obsolete. They want protection and they want a better world for their kids after them, um, female and male. But they want male experiences to not be such a negative thing. And now we're going to talk about the quick limitations, future, and implications of this study and the results that it found. So, in terms of the limitations, we talked about this at the very beginning. There are very few studies that allow it to be solely on male experiences during disclosing childhood abuse. So, the majority of the studies involving male CSAs have relatively small sample size due to challenges in recruiting in the vulnerable population. Recruitment characteristics for this study only allowed men who had recently received or were currently receiving services to participate in the study, which could have contributed to two problems. One, people who receive help while participating in the study might be inclined to share their experience with disclosure more willingly than those who have never received help. And two, all disclosure experiences of men who have received help for their CSA is potentially quite different from the disclosure experiences of men who have never sought services. So there's two limitations just within the study right now, along with the limited data and the limited population that's willing to come forward because of the same taboo kind of nature of male sexual abuse that happens today, that happened when they were children. So research and data are all limited, like we just talked about. So future research opportunities are vast. While this study seemed to look at the majority of negative experiences, we need to know more about the positive experiences. Our society is ever changing and adapting, and the invisible male, which we talked about at the very beginning of the study, which is considered the male who isn't, who's forgotten, who isn't, their story isn't told because of X amount of reasons, can no longer be a thing. It can't. We can't. We can't ignore such a vulnerable but large population of abuse survivors and victims. We need to be aware of how to help survivors feel more at ease and feel supported. The data and the findings of this article just mean that we have room for growth as a society and within our individualized fields and practices. We can take this information and practice active listening, open minds, and judgment free responses so that someone we know, we care about, or if someone we love, or a stranger, or even ourselves, if we want to disclose or have disclosed to someone or someone has disclosed to us, we know how to show care and give each survivor a positive experience. I'm really grateful that you've stuck in 18 minutes long, and I hope this conversation on the discussion board is something that you really think about, because this study had a big impact on me and the population that I serve within the community as a teacher and a foster parent, and the population that's around me just in the community in general. Um, I really am excited to see some of your responses. Happy Monday. Hope this wasn't too painful. Bye.